They called her mad when she walked away from the Casa Grande as smoke poured from its eaves. An elegant woman in a dress darkened by ash, hair loose for the first time in years, the hem of her skirt catching on a broken step. As she moved through the garden, where jacarandas had stood for generations, they called it madness. They whispered it in the market, wrote it in the papers in Rio, and told it in salons 100 miles inland. A baron's wife had set her home on fire, and no respectable woman did such a thing. Listen, though. This is a reconstruction, a work of historical fiction, imagined from fragments and testimony, meant to recover a story that official records would rather forget. Stay with me. By the end, you will understand why what looked like madness was something else entirely. The Vale do Paraíba spread like a stage set of contradiction. On the river terraces, the sugar mills and fazendas leaned into light, whitewashed facades reflecting imperial privilege, painted shutters, tiled roofs, chandeliers that made the night bright inside rooms where men in frock coats quarreled over ledgers and horseshoes. Beneath that sheen ran a darker tide. The censalas, the slave quarters, long rows of wooden shacks where people lived in the shadow of the Casa Grande, where their tongues and bodies were property. The economy of the region pulsed on the labor of those who were denied personhood, the law protecting masters, the church offering sermons whose prayers rarely reached the censalas. In that world, silence had become a kind of currency. You kept quiet to live another day. You learned the art of not being seen. Honorio de Almeida held his title like an heirloom. He wore it the way other men wore their gold chains, as proof that the world granted him rights above his debts. He was a baron by name and a gambler by temperament, a public man whose private recklessness emptied ledgers like a pestilence. In public, he received the provincial elite with the polite rage of someone who could charm creditors with a laugh and a glass of brandy. In private, when the clocks had long since stopped their polite tick, his moods grew black, sharp as knives. The house knew him in the creak of its stair, the servants knew him in the way he slammed doors. Debts arrived on horseback from Rio in the formality of letters and in the rustle of inked paper. The arrival of a financier from the city could mean only one thing: accounts to settle, fortunes to be tallied, claims to be made. Cecília had been raised to be always seen, but never heard. The world that formed her believed that women like her were ornaments, delicate and instructive, a pale smile beneath a veil, a soft hand on a piano during a visit from a minister, a polite conversation about the weather and the harvest. Her name, Sina Cecília, as it appeared in marriage registers and on invitation cards, carried a lineage of fine women who married well and kept the house. As a young bride, she learned the choreography of being a baron's wife. How to walk down a parlor toward servants with measured grace, where to place her hands during a portrait sitting, which expressions would keep the gossip sweet. The lessons were patient and relentless. They taught her the grammar of silence. Vicente watched, not with the thin glare of hatred, nor with the brittle hope of a man who had nothing to lose, rather with an economy of attention honed by years of necessity. He had been born on that estate, marked by small privileges that meant nothing against the chains, the trust of a master who liked him to handle the stables, the scars of tasks that asked the body for more than it had to give. Vicente learned to understand the rhythms of the house, the schedule of the cook, the way Honorio's temper flared after losing a hand at cards, the patterns of when the coffer's keys moved from locked to hidden. In the Cenzala, men and women spoke in low voices, trading news in the evenings. Vicente listened for names, for slips of bankers' tongues. He counted the debts in the air like a man counting horses. He watched, because watching was a tool. It was a map that might one day show a way out. The inciting night began as the worst sort of domestic emergency. A man from Rio arrived with papers and a posture like a blade. The financier was not theatrical, he was efficient. He had come to collect on lines of credit, on what Honorio had been unwilling or unable to pay. In the drawing room, beneath a chandelier whose crystals cast more reputation than light, the conversation snapped like a cord. Honorio's face went hard. The baron's laugh grew thin. What followed was chaos contained in a single terrible motion. The financier fell, not messy, not cinematic, but final. Those who would later insist on madness would insist on a type of frenzy, but the killing itself was a moment of panic that left both Baron and house shaken. The sound of footsteps running across marble and the sudden awful hush after a body gives way. Vicente saw it. He saw the financier's hand push the ledgers aside, the way a ribbon of blood darkened the edge of the Persian carpet, the Baron's hand trembling as if the weight of his title had become too heavy to lift. For those in the Cenzala, the sight was a turning point, from witness to power inversion. The men who would later be counted, 6 of them, gathered in the dim spaces behind the kitchen, men whose lives the house had shaped with merciless exactness. They discussed the risk like tradesmen haggling over charcoal, measured, practical, eyes never leaving the doorway. No one moved by romance. They had, each in his own way, reasons to fear Honorio and reasons to see what his ruin could mean. What followed was not a melodrama of vengeance, but the blunt instrument of leverage. With the knowledge of the murder came possibilities and dangers. For discovery meant chains tightened, punishments severe beyond imagination. The 6 men held a weapon the house never accounted for: truth. They could tell the authorities, and in that society the voice of an enslaved witness did not carry the weight of a gentleman's accusation, yet the mere possibility of exposure threatened the Baron's carefully constructed respectability. So they acted as actors in a grim negotiation. The demand they made was personal and political at once: silence, in exchange for something no ledger could measure. The terms were humiliating and precise. Honorio, to guarantee their silence, must surrender his wife, deliver her into the knights of the Cenzala. The order was not about tenderness. It was about proof that the Baron cared more for his freedom than for the dignity of his household. It was about forcing a man who thought of people as property to pay with what he considered property. Imagine Cecilia's world at that moment. The drawing room she once moved through like a bird trapped in gilded cage now turned into a space of contestation she was not allowed to witness. The house that raised her had become a site of calculation, where she was an object of exchange. She was offered as a guarantee, a pledge. The act of being handed over in the nights that followed was not described in lurid detail in the testimonies that reached later ears. It was rendered in the private language of shame and small deaths. Humiliation does not scream. It accumulates like dust. A look, a misplaced hand, a commanded silence. Each indignity stacked into a slow corrosion of self. Cecilia's childhood training in silence had been perverse, shaping in her a receptiveness to being overlooked. She had been taught to fold herself into smallness. But smallness is not weakness. It can become, in the hands of a person given no other recourse, a space to hide a strategy. Honorio, for his part, continued to be both head and ruin. He stayed the public baron, receiving letters and men, jesting over brandy, while inside he was narrowed by fear. To the men from the Cenzala, his compliance with their terms became a proof of his vulnerability. They did not desire to punish Cecilia for who she was. They used the weapon they had been given. For the Baron, the arrangement was a theatrical compromise. He believed that shutting his mouth and complying with a forced exchange of dignity would preserve his life and estate. He misread the scale of what he had set in motion. The months that followed were a slow siege of the house and of Cecilia's interior life. Humiliation, in its most ruinous form, is often not performed for the world, but enacted in private scenes meant to sever a person from their name. Cecilia learned to measure herself through the eyes of those who had been taught to look only at ownership. Night after night she endured leaves of her identity being stripped. The turning of keys, the shifting of beds, the naming of her by possessive terms in voices that meant nothing. The Cenzala nights were an instrument, but they were also a mirror. She came to understand the depth of her husband's callousness, how his wealth allowed him to commodify even his marriage. She rehearsed collapse in her mind and then refused it. Refusal did not come as a sudden flare, but as the slow building of a cold, efficient resolve. During this time, Vicente's acquaintance with the house deepened into a plan. His patience, which had always been practical, turned strategic. He watched how servants moved, how keys were hidden under floorboards, where ledgers rested when the Baron drank too long. He noted the places where the house assumed ownership over silence, the library that held letters no one in the Cenzala could read, the coffer locked in a study whose window faced east, the servant's door that let in early light. He learned Honorio's patterns, the hour he took his brandy, the watchman's rotation, the day the gardener tended to the jacarandas. These were not dramatic moments, but small facts a man could use like tools. Cecilia and Vicente met in a manner that is almost mundane, almost ordinary. A stolen look by the well, a hand extended at a moment when grief and secrecy made two people understand each other. They did not share a love of the sort played on stage. Their alliance was born of mutual understanding of damage and possibility. She had the keys to the social world, her name, access to rooms, to papers, to the family coffer's map. He had the network of people whose lives the house had controlled, and the patience to orchestrate a night. They spoke in low tones, touching on practicalities, not on fantasies of escape, but on logistics. She would give access, papers that might appear to be freedom, but would be false alforrias unless their plan succeeded. He would make the theft and enact a kind of justice they both understood in harsher terms than law could afford. There are moments in history when the practical collides with the symbolic, and the result is not tidy. The plan they built was careful and stripped of theatricality. It required that Honorio be removed from the center of control without killing him outright in the eyes of the law, because killing would invite a greater scrutiny that might end in the Cenzala being punished beyond what Vicente's group could endure. So they designed an outcome, one that would incapacitate the Baron enough to prevent effective resistance, but leave his life technically intact. A poison was chosen not for bloodlust, but for its capacity to paralyze the body, while leaving the mind alarmingly aware. Poison is a cruel tool, because it creates witnesses who cannot act. Honorio would be trapped inside himself as the estate burned, a presence rendered impotent by substances that slowed the pulse and the limbs, but allowed the eyes to see. The night of the execution was taught with the kind of quiet only the most dangerous evenings possess. The servants' doors were watched, the guards shifted by the hour. Cecilia's hand shook when she poured the drink, not from fear of being caught in the act. That was a practical calculation she had already weathered, but from the knowledge of what this meant, not vengeance as a feverish surge, but the precise administration of a measure that would make the system visible in its terror. The poison did not make Honorio scream. He sat as a man might sit on a familiar bench and realize the world had slipped beneath him. His limbs failed in that slow, arresting way that allows a person to look at the room and remember the scent of a carriage, the color of a wife's sleeve, the shame of a debt. These small details compounded into a torture that the storytellers later refused to dwell on because it complicated their simple narratives. In the interval of paralysis, the 6 men enacted the theft. They moved through the house with the knowledge born of servitude, blind spots, paneling, the way a lamp was turned at night to hide a hand. They robbed not out of greed for treasures that would glitter in markets, but with the dull, precise objective of removing the coffer and anything that testified to Honorio's power. The coffer contained ledgers, bonds, bills of sale, receipts that embedded the Baron's authority in paper. To take the coffer was to take his legal claim to stability. The men worked quickly and cleanly, like men who had practiced the arts of silence and stealth for years. When the last lock surrendered, they replaced it with their own mark, hidden beneath knots of old rope. A signature that would mean nothing to the courts but everything to those who knew. Then the torches were lit. Fire in that world had always been a dual language, a destructive force and a purifier for those who had no other rituals of righting wrongs. The men did not set the house ablaze in a fury. They executed it like a military operation. They used oil in careful quantities, placed it in attics in places where the architecture would carry the flames through the decorative fittings and the gilded plaster. Fire, they understood, would speak to a public used to polished facades and silent workers. Smoke would flatten into testimonies that the wealthy distrusted. It would expose cracked plaster and the bones of a house that had been strengthened by inequality. The blaze did what the law could not. It destroyed the visible monument of power. Cecilia walked away while the house burned. She did not run. She did not scream. She moved with the exhausted grace of someone who had passed through a long winter and came out with frost in her eyelashes. In accounts that later become gossip, that image is the pivot from madness to agency. A woman in a shredded dress stepping into the rain-lit night, ash in her hair like a coronation of a very different kind. She left behind the things that had defined her. Portrait frames, trinkets, the smell of her mother's perfume in a dressing drawer. The act of leaving was not a theatrical renunciation of femininity. It was a refusal to remain as an object in the ledger of a household. She disappeared into a country that, though not welcoming, had places hidden from the eyes of men who counted property as life. Some say she took a boat. Some say she crossed a mountain pass. The truth is that the story dissolves into rumor and memory, which was precisely part of the cover the conspirators counted on. When the fire finished with the house, there was little left to interrogate. The authorities came with the slow politeness of men more interested in preserving reputation than excavating truth. Official reports murmured of an accidental candle, of a faulty stove. The coffer was missing, yes, but the ledgers were said to have been destroyed by smoke. The journalist in the provincial capital wrote a piece about negligence and the fragility of wooden mansions. The elite preferred a narrative that allowed them to continue their polite gatherings without admitting the violence that structured their world. For them, it was easier to accept arson by an unstable woman than to reckon with the calculus that had made the house possible. Memory, however, is not a single ledger. It is a palimpsest. In the Cenzala, the story was told differently. It became a tale of strategy and survival. How men who had been enslaved found an instrument that the Baron had never imagined he would lose: his respectability. They spoke of Vicente in a way the papers never did, a man whose mind had learned to measure risk with the careful economy of someone who had to do so to see another sunrise. Cecilia's name in the Cenzalas and in whispers among servants turned from an emblem of fragility into a figure of quiet vengeance. Not everyone in those conversations called what happened justice. Some feared the reprisal that the larger world could bring. Others celebrated the small, precise inversion of power that had been achieved. They called her not madness, but method. They called the night a necessary punctuation in a sentence that had been written by others for too long. There is an ethical knot at the center of this story that resists easy untangling. The act was violent, property was lost, people were exposed to danger, and a man was left alive but incapacitated in a way that imposed a unique suffering. Yet the Baron's life had been built on systemic violence, a machine that turned entire human bodies into tools for profit and social prestige. How should we weigh the moral scales? In law, murder is a crime. In an unjust social world, murder can be a language of desperate reply. The story invites us not to pronounce verdicts, but to listen to context. When a person is taught to be silent for a lifetime, and then is used as a commodity without recourse, what options remain? Is the destruction of a symbol of oppression an act of revenge, or a forcible attempt at justice where the legal system will not, cannot, intervene? History, as always, is a craft of those who write it down. Official archives, clerical notes, and polite gossip smoothed the edges of the event. They recorded the fire as an accident and the woman who left as unstable. In the salons of the Vale, the story was an anecdote to amuse guests, wealth undone by feminine hysteria. But in the low voices of the Cenzala and the kitchens, the narrative persisted with other intents, as testimony of complicity, as strategy acknowledged and sometimes celebrated by those who had no access to official recourse. Power's habit is to name its own preservation common sense. It calls the actions of the powerless by any name that blunts their meaning. Madness, in this case, was a convenient brushstroke. Cecilia's disappearance fit the pattern of erasure that comfortable institutions prefer. Once the house was gone and the coffer missing, evidence could be molded into the story those with ink and influence preferred. Laws preferred reputations to the messy truth of what enabled them. The Baron, humiliated and yet officially alive, found himself subject to the pity of his peers and the judgment of godless rumor, a curiosity to be commented upon, not a subject for legal rigor. The men who enacted the plan faded into lives that continued under layers of silence and caution. Vicente lived, in memory, as a man who had done what he and others were forced to do, use the limited resources available to an enslaved person to strike a blow against a system that could not be reformed by polite means. We must not romanticize what happened. The execution of the plan involved hard choices and inflicted harm, It was not a drama of heroes and villains reduced to caricature. Honorio was not merely a monster, he was a man whose vices and privileges had been cultivated by an entire structure. Cecilia was not merely a sinner or saint, she was a person whose dignity had been slowly extinguished until only a single decisive action remained. Vicente was not simply an avenger, he was a strategist who knew how to turn a devastating truth into leverage. All of them were products of a society that measured people by value and legal worth. What remains, stubborn and unresolved, is the question the story throws back at us. Who gets to tell the past? The official press called the event by the simplest name that would keep the world as it was: eccentricity, madness, accident. The silenced told another story, one of calculated redress, of a violence that mirrored the systemic violence inflicted by the Baron. Those two stories do not cancel each other. They exist in tension, in the dialectic of how communities remember and how power manipulates memory. The ruins of Santa Edvig, the Casa Grande by another name that the Baron once loved and then watched burn, became a place of small pilgrimages for some. Peasants and servants who kept oral histories would gesture to a broken column, to a charred beam, and tell children in low voices of a night when the house that had measured their lives by ownership was burned to ash. To the elite, those ruins were a shameful memory best left covered in ivy and silence. To others, the smoke that rose was a sign that history had teeth, that it could bite, even if the bite came cloaked in what the world labeled irrationality. Let me be clear. This is a reconstruction of probable events based on testimony and context, a work of historical fiction intended to recover a story official records preferred to render ambiguous. It does not claim documentary certainty about every detail. Rather, it aims to render plausible the motives and the human scale of decisions made in a world where law, custom, and power conspired against the dignity of many. We tell it to remember how fragile human respect can be when institutions refuse to protect it. If this story moves you, if you want more recovered memories like this that press into the silences of history, subscribe and like. The work of remembering is small and collective, and these are the fragments we can still gather. There are images I cannot leave you with without a final reflection. Think of the lace of Cecilia's dress stuck on a broken banister as she walked away. Think of Vicente's hands, calloused and clean, closing the coffer and taking out the ledgers that proved how a baron's wealth depended on debt and blood. Think of the Cenzala night as not only a space of suffering, but as a place where strategies of survival were discussed in whispers. The fire consumed the house, but it did not erase the question: who pays for a life? Who pays when the law will not? When the dust settled, the official narrative did what power often does. It flattened complexity into a word, madness, and thus excused itself of responsibility to look deeper. Yet for those who lived it, for those whose silence was the cost of survival, that night was not lunacy. It was an answer formed in the only voice they had: action. Whether that action was vengeance or an attempt at justice depends on the scale of the moral lens you bring. Ask yourself then, if the law offers no remedy, if commerce and titles protect atrocity, do the oppressed have no recourse but to become instruments of their own retribution? Or does the moral calculus require other answers? These questions have no tidy resolutions. They are the questions that historians and ordinary people both wrestle with when confronted by evidence that power produces its own myths to survive. The story of Cecilia, who left the house in flames, who some called mad, invites us to look at the structural cruelties that made such an act comprehensible. It forces us to reckon with the way memory is shaped by the voices that write down events, and by those who prefer to keep the records polite. Remember, this narrative is a reconstruction, not a journalistic record. It tries to hold the moral ambiguities without flattening them into simple lessons. The burning of a Casa Grande is not a solution to injustice. It is an emblem of what happens when systems refuse to reform, and when people, finally seeing that no institution will answer them, act with the only available tools. What do you think? Vengeance or justice? Share your thoughts below and pass this story on to someone who believes history should include the voices of those who were told to be silent.